Hey, good morning. My name is Greg Hodge. I serve as the Interim Executive Director for the Executive Alliance for Boys and Men of Color. Thank you all for joining us this morning for a very important conversation about surveillance in our communities, how it affects our immigrant community as well as our broader people of color community. We have some very powerful speakers with us this morning, a group of women who you'll be introduced to in just a second, who are leaders in the field, who are voices for real transformation in terms of how information is shared about us and with whom. This morning, I want to start by also thanking our staff and our consultants who put this together, Niaz Kazravi, Ariana Austin, Akin Ayeboye, and others who have been helping us make this go. We want to thank the Alliance for Boys and Men of Color as a co-sponsor, funders for Boys and Men of Color here in California, the Funders for Justice, and the Rosenberg Foundation, who are co-sponsoring today's webinar.
I work at the Ford Foundation. I'm speaking to you all today in my personal capacity, and I'm really excited to introduce this discussion. Some of our goals today are to demystify, untangle, and define surveillance, as well as as a police tactic, as well as a technology.
Thinking about surveillance technology and the kinds of surveillance technology that we focus on at the Hub, we don't focus on just one specific type. We've been working on an overview of the field in general. So I have a slide as a visual of all of the different types of surveillance technology and what it could look like. It could be actual technology, but it can also take the form of policing tactics and other versions. So we focus on a variety of things. The overall theme is that surveillance technology used by law enforcement in this country is not transparent, so it's hard to track until after the fact that it's used. So we've been looking at different types, and this slide shows the few different versions that it can take and the ways that it's used. This is not exhaustive. There's always new and emerging things happening. But the first thing is innovation measures. We often see progress and efficiency taking the form of things like facial recognition, algorithms used to decide or make decisions based on people's criminal records or histories. We see things like smart cities that have the promise of efficient streetlights or other technology, but that has sensors and cameras that the police have access to, and it's not always transparent that the police have access to this and they can use it. And then another form of surveillance that we've been seeing is this neighbor versus neighbor type of thing. So things like the Nextdoor app, the Citizen app, your doorbell cameras. Well, yes, it's understandable that you could use them for safety or connecting with your neighbors. They also have been used to criminalize people within your neighborhood.
I work at Action Center on Race and the Economy, or ACRE, which is a campaign hub for organizations working at the intersection of racial justice and Wall Street accountability. So we provide research and communication infrastructure and strategic support for organizations working on campaigns to win like real structural change. And so Kelcey laid out a lot for us. And the way we define technology or surveillance at ACRE is through the same lens that we do all of our work. And that lens is racial capitalism. So who benefits from the constant watching of our neighbors and who are the targets? ACRE is explicitly an anti-capitalist, anti-racist, and an abolitionist organization. So our work in surveillance has exposed the ways that it's used to criminalize people and how it's been normalized in the ways that we've interacted with people. So things like doorbell cameras are normal. Things like cameras for people to wear that don't surveil. For example, police officers, they actually surveil us. And so we see surveillance as a form of policing that needs to be abolished and replaced with more community prescribed and democratically controlled forms of public safety. And we have a saying constantly in our teams that we are not trying to replace cops with cameras. We are trying to replace them with actual safety. And so when we look at what happens after defund, we want to make sure that we're not living in a surveillance state.
So for us, we started to really notice that ICE was for a long time working really closely with local police departments, right, as a way of entangling people to then be able to not only criminalize and arrest, but then detain and deport. But what we started to notice is that the way that they were doing that was starting to change. And so ICE was not only relying on a local jail to go after someone, but they were going directly to their door And we started to ask ourselves the question, how did they know that they lived there? How did they know who their cousin was? How did they know like who was driving the car and where they were going? And so we put together in 2018 a report called Who's Behind ICE, the tech and data companies fueling deportations, where we began to do a lot of research to really map out who are the private and corporate partners that are working with ICE and the Department of Homeland Security to help ICE create this huge dragnet.
I think at Interrupting Criminalization, we would define surveillance as anything, any mechanism of monitoring behavior for the purposes of control and punishment, and that can take place through criminalization, but it also can take place through civil liability. It can take place through family court and other sort of helping social services. And it can also take place through the medical industrial complex through forced medical treatment. And in the context of forced medical treatment, and also to push people towards forced medical treatment. And so for us at Interrupting Criminalization, we're really focused on what is the point of contact between individuals and law enforcement that start chain reactions that land people in cages of all kinds, whether it's prisons, jails, police precincts, state hospitals, and forced incarceration, or into any kind of system where people's lives are surveilled and policed and controlled. The entire family court system is based on surveillance, and that's a place that's also about behavior modification and control that disproportionately targets Black and Brown people, and that parenthood is surveilled in very different ways depending on who's engaged in it, right? So the person who's written, I think, a great deal about this is Dorothy Roberts. She's written about, for instance, seeing a white mother drop her kid off at school, 30 minutes early every morning, presumably because she didn't have childcare, and just leave the kid in the playground, and there was never a consequence for that parent. No one was even watching that white mother and what she was doing, whereas a Black mother doing that, we all know, would involve a very different consequence. But the different consequence would come in part because of increased surveillance about what Black mothers are doing with their children or not doing, because they're accessing public services, because they're living in public housing, because they're attending public hospitals, or because there's an inherent sort of sharper gaze directed at Black parents in public spaces. If they smack a kid for trying to take a chocolate bar or something at a store, there's a very different response, for instance, as my mother did to me often, that there's a different response to that than if a white parent is disciplining their child, including in very violent ways.
And then you can take that to your own campaigns wherever you are to try to influence your local government, state government, federal government, to try to take action around oversight and regulation of these things, because without that oversight and that regulation, we see it disproportionately target people of color, low-income communities, but we also see it targeting civil rights and First Amendment rights, which affects all of us. So there are things at stake for everybody here. But we have seen some successful campaigns around the country, things around facial recognition bans. Particularly, I'd say that some of the best recommendations right now, in the absence or in the slow-moving process of federal and state level oversight and legislation, we have seen organizations of community members, coalitions of advocates and organizers come together at the local level to challenge surveillance in their cities. And we've seen a few successes. I'm thinking about the Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission, which has the power to outright ban certain technology, and they've also created oversight legislation that's future-proof in the sense that it will keep up with all of this emerging technology, rather than doing it piecemeal or retroactively. And that's a model that would benefit the country overall as we wait for state and federal level to catch up. And for funders, just to add, for funders, the people disproportionately targeted by surveillance are going to be the experts about the solutions when it comes to these things. So I definitely think that a good recommendation would be to work with the people on the ground who are affected by this, pour resources and money into that. And that way they can take it to their local leaders, to their state leaders, to show them that there is serious concern around privacy and civil rights and protection. And this is something that we have to reckon with now.
And we've definitely seen cameras and things like Project Greenlight in Detroit, which is a system of cameras across the city being used to both monitor social distancing and mask requirements and criminalize people for non-compliance, and to monitor and criminalize people engaged in protest, and to falsely accuse Black people of doing things now for the second time based on facial recognition. So we've definitely seen the tools of surveillance that we're seeing operating, for instance, as we usually do in protests, where there's drones and cameras and officers videotaping and using individuals who are live streaming or videotaping or photographing, or media, video and photograph being used in the context of protests, now also being used in the context of enforcement of public health orders in partnership through the Hub and Borealis. The first call I had with them was like, oh, we're getting these, we did a participatory budgeting process and people voted that they wanted cameras. And so now we need legislation to figure out how the footage on the cameras is being used and making sure that it's being used for the right thing and not the wrong thing. And it's like having that conversation by being like, what's the right thing? Like, what would be the right thing for those cameras to be used for? And then actually, oh, there is no right thing. It's just dangerous. And instead of trying to regulate them or oversight them, we should get rid of them, right? And I think that there's opportunities in the current defund moment to really talk about what the alternative is. And I think that takes us then to a question, like new conversations about what safety is.
I think for us as organizers, we always have the kind of the dual job of like dismantling all of the horrible things that have happened for centuries, and then also being forward thinking in terms of where are the next places of flight, and also what kind of new frameworks are we offering up to figure out how we have those fights. And so I think this particular issue of surveillance is kind of at that, like, just at that right, like, intersection of all of that, which makes it really difficult to do, but also really exciting and really kind of like where a lot of us are going to be going. And so I think that it's just important to kind of notice how we're resourcing those fights, and then also how we're talking about them, because as Tracey said, it's so much of it about is narrative shift and actually like activating different communities to plug into their fight. So on the No Tech for ICE website, like, we've been focused on like a comic strip and a workshop guide for frontline communities to understand what this is. And at the same time, like a policy toolkit for local lawmakers. And at the same time, like lots of corporate research for all of the investors to know how to like plug in. And at the same time, thinking about how workers and future tech workers are also plugging into these conversations, so that, you know, having a job at Palantir is actually seen as a bad thing, not as like the next step in your career ladder, right? So I think all of those cultures are shifting at the same time, and it is actually about trying to figure out how we can all have a similar, you know, whirlwind effect where we're pushing in the same direction. And so I think that's just kind of both the exciting moment that we're in, but also the challenging part of it is kind of being able to translate that for funders, that I think has been a little bit, yeah, just difficult, and something that we want to continue to figure out how to do, because there's a lot more work to be done.
I'm noticing more and more how much of the funding world is tech companies. And I wonder if there's something funders can be doing in their peer groups around pressuring tech companies who are also funding a lot of the work that's to ironically fight the things that they're doing. So to just be really careful and thoughtful about yeah, how much of the funding world is now controlled by tech or fed by tech or fueled by tech, and how we might address that.
I hope that everyone is leaving this conversation feeling like there's work to do, work that we can identify, and work that we can fund. Thank you all. Gregory?
I want to thank all of you. Cynthia, thank you so much for a great job this morning. And to Andrea, Tracey, Jacinta, Kelcey, thank you all for doing the work you're doing. You've given the rest of us who don't do this part of the work all day, every day, an opening, a leading edge conversation, and this notion of sort of forward thinking vigilance and helping us have some power over the paranoia. That's my big takeaway quote for today.